In this video, we will start to implement the controller file, and the first piece of functionality we will be implementing is the ability to get one task by providing a task ID. So if we start by opening Atom, and on the left we'll be creating a new file within the controller folder. So if I right click, new file, and we'll just call this task.php. First thing to do is to start the PHP file. And then what we're going to do is call in all of the other files that we've created so far. So we'll need the DB file because that's our database connection. We'll also need the response file because we'll be generating responses from this controller file now. And we'll also bring in the task file because we will be creating tasks. So require once. And the first one is db.php. Next one, require once. This one's in the model folder, so we'll have to navigate up to model. And then task.php. And then same again, it's in the model folder. And this one is response.php. So we've called in relevant files now in our controller. I'm just going to save that. Now the first thing we're going to do is attempt to connect to the database. Remember, anything to do with a database can trigger an exception, so we'll have to sort of encompass this in a try and catch statement. So we'll try, and then we are going to catch, and the exception is a PDO exception, and we'll just give it a name. Oops, put that back up there. Right, so in here we need to create our database connections. Remember, there'll be a write database connection and a read database connection, so we'll create them now. Right, db equals, and remember it's a static method, so we'll call the name of the class followed by the name of the static method. Connect write db and read db. Connect read db. We'll save that. So these are the methods that were created in the DB class before. So we've got connect write db, connect read db. So we've called them to attempt to connect to the database. Now if it fails, what we want to do is output one of our standard responses, the 500 error message like we demoed in one of the previous videos. So we'll set the response up now. So response, and we need to create a new response. And then what we want to do is set the status code. So response set HTTP status code, and this would be a 500 because it's a server error if it can't connect to the database. And the next thing we want to do is set the success to false because it's an error. And then we'll add a message. And we'll just put a string of database connection error. And the next thing we need to do is obviously send that response back. So we'll just run this send method. Okay, we'll save that. So now what will happen is it'll attempt to connect to the database or both connections on the read and the write. And then if it can't, we will get a standard response back as a 500. Now, as well as sending the response back, we want to log it in a error log file. So our system administrators could potentially find out if the sort of the MySQL server is periodically timing out or something like that. Now, you wouldn't display the true exception error to the user. One, they won't be interested, and two, sometimes it can contain sensitive data such as usernames and things like that. So you never want to display the error sort of to the user themselves. But we want to log it just from a system administration point of view. So what we'll do here is use the built-in PHP error log function, and that's error log, and we will say the type of message. So we can say connection error, and then what we can do is append the PDO exception on that. So AX takes another parameter of where you want to send this error message. Now you can look this method up yourself online, but 0 basically means that it stores it in the PHP error log file, and that's fine because our system administrator should be sort of looking through that periodically anyway. I'll just save that. So now that I've got our response, normally what I do after I've sent it out is type exit. Just make sure that no following code that comes after this can run. I'm just exiting the script, and because we've already sent the response, that's sort of a nice sort of way to end. So the next thing we need to do is now start thinking about the logic of the API and what sort of things we need to do. In this video, obviously we're concentrating on getting a single task, so that's what we'll start implementing now. So in order to get a single task, we obviously need to pass in a task ID into the URL. The idea is that we would have a route such as task /task/1, and what that'll do is get the single task with an ID of 1. Now this bit is sort of prettified, and we'll do this near the end of the video, but the way to understand how it'll work is if I just show you task ID equals 1. So you're probably familiar with this sort of URL here, and you have parameters or URL query strings as they're called that you append to the file in a web address. So what we're doing here is task ID equals 1. So this value here is obviously we're going to pick this up and utilize that in our SQL statement to retrieve that task. So the first thing we need to do is to do an if statement, because we need to check to see if it exists. So if and query strings, they're passed in via the get method. You could be posting or you could be deleting, but anything that's in the query string, you use the get superglobal to pick this out. Basically, get is an array of key values. So we're looking for a key of task ID, and we'll be picking the value out of that. So we need to first check if task ID exists. So we'll use the function array key exists, and we're looking for the task ID, and we're looking for that in the get superglobal. So now that we've got that, I'll just expand this and I'll just scroll down slightly so I can see where we are. So this says if you provide a task ID, then do whatever in here. So the first thing we need to do is actually get that task ID. So you can see here that there is something that has been presented to us in the task ID. So we need to get that. So we'll just call it task ID for the time being. And we'll get this and task ID. So what I'm doing here is calling the get. So within the get array, there could be multiple in the query string. So we'll get the task ID. Now what we want to do is just to make sure it's valid data. So we'll just do some simple checks on it. So if task ID is blank, because we're going to throw out a standard error message, a standard error response. If it's not valid data, just like what we've done in our task model and stuff like that. So if it's blank, or if it is not numeric, just put that in there, task ID, then we're going to respond back with an error response. So we'll create a new response. Oops, sorry. Call it response, new response, and then we'll just build this up as normal. So response set HTTP status code, and we'll give it a 400 because 400 is a client error, so that means that we haven't provided the right type of data from the client side. So, and we'll set success to false. Set success false, and we can add some messages in here. So we'll say, oops, response add message, and we'll just give it a string. Task ID cannot be blank or must be numeric. There we go. That's a fairly simple error message. And then we want to send it. And then exit. So now we've done our error check on the passed in task ID. The next thing we need to do is to check what type of request method it is. Remember, we're getting a single task, so we'll be using the request method of get. Now, if we step back a little bit and just think about the types of things you will do on a single task, we'll sort of add these in as a placeholder now, because this is the correct point to add these in. So on a single task, you can retrieve it, you can delete a single task, and you can also update a single task. So they're the three things we'll be doing on a single task. Whilst we're on here, why don't we add these in as placeholders so we can build it up as we go along in these videos. We need to check what the request method is. So if statement, and then we'll use the server superglobal, and we'll get the request method. So that's request method, and we'll do a check to see if that is, in the first instance, get. Now this is all the kind of logic that you need to work out what sort of request method it is. Now I'll just, like I say, I'll create these placeholders, and then we'll sort of build them up from here. So that's that, and then else if, and then we'll just do exactly the same. So server, always miss the underscores out, make sure you put them in, I keep missing them out. Request method, and then we mentioned delete, so we'll handle the delete, and we will also, so else if server request method, and the one for updating, if you can remember, it is patch. So patch. Now what we want to do if it's not any of them, so say they send in another one such as post, you would never post on a single task, you would post just on tasks, because post is normally used for creating. So you couldn't post task 1 because it doesn't really mean anything. How can you create task 1? The system automatically gives you the identifier or the task ID, so why would you provide one? So we'll just put a catch-all at the bottom which errors or handles a standard error response. And what we do here is just build up a standard response as normal, and we use the status code of 405, which basically means request method not allowed. So it's a catch-all for any sort of request method that's not get, delete, or patch. So what we'll do here is build up the response. And the first thing is, we need to create the response and then start building it up. So response set HTTP status code, and this is a 405, and then we'll set response up, and we'll set the success as false, and we will add a message, and the message will be request method not allowed, and then we'll send that back. And we'll exit. So you can see here we've started building up the placeholders. Obviously we'll do these in a later video, and the one we're going to be concentrating on is this get method. So I'm just going to minimize these for the time being, just to sort of make it simpler on the screen, and I'm just going to create some space in here. So now that we've got our request method set up, and we'll just focus on get at the moment. First thing we need to do is to try and retrieve the task from the database with a passed in task ID. So we need to attempt to query the database. Like anything else with the database, it's between a try and catch statement. So we'll create our try and our catch. And what we'll do is PDO exception, because it's the database, and we'll just call it AX. And we'll start building the query up. So we'll just say query, and then the way that you create a query using PDO is you use prepared statements. Now we'll show you here how to build these up. Just stepping back a little bit, we'll have two database connections. We've got the read and the write database connections. Now when you think about it, what we're doing is just literally retrieving a task. So we don't need to set up the write database, we don't need it to be synchronous, we just need to retrieve the task from the database. If we use the read database, that means that could potentially reduce the load on the master database server. So we use read db, and then what you do is call prepare, and then what you do is pass in the SQL query. So what we want to do is retrieve everything to do with the task, so that's the ID, the title, the description, the deadline, and the completed status. So select ID, title, description, deadline, we'll come back to that in a second, and completed. From, and our table was TBL tasks, but we'll put where the ID is equal to task ID. Now you're probably thinking, what's this, if you don't really know much about PDO and prepared statements, but this is like a placeholder, and what we'll do, we'll bind a variable to this value that gets inserted here. This stops SQL injection and all of the other sort of nasty stuff, so it's a good way to sort of do your database queries. So as I mentioned before, we'll come back to deadline, because what we want to do is format this, because this is held as a date in the database. We want to format this to be consistent with all of our other dates. Now that is day, month, year, space, hour, colon, minute. So we need to use the date format function from MySQL. So the first thing is the deadline and then the mask. So we will put in, we will put in the mask. So that is %d slash %m, slash %y space %h colon %i. So we will be retrieving the deadline, but in this format. So day, month, year, hour, minute. So if we're just on the next line, we need to bind the parameter. So what we'll do is query, query, if I never spell query correct. And then it's called bind param, because we want to insert the task ID into the SQL query. The first thing is which placeholder was it in the SQL. So it was task ID, and what is the variable that you want to insert in there, and that was task ID. So this task ID is the one that we got from the URL, basically the query string. So we'll store that in the task ID. We've already done our validation checks on it, so hopefully we should have a number. So task ID, and the type is PDO param int, because it's an integer number. It's a number basically. Okay, so now that we've built the query up, we need to execute it. So query execute, that should run it. Now hopefully if we've supplied a valid task ID, we should get some rows back. Well, a row, because you know task IDs are unique. So we need to check. So if we just create a new variable called row count and query row count, so that should store the row count, and then what we need to do is check to see if any rows were retrieved. If not, if there were 0 rows, then we can send a standard response to say task not found. Now if you can remember back to the status codes, have you browsed the internet and you've clicked on a page and something hasn't been found, you normally get a 404 error. So that's what we're going to return. So first of all, for check the row count, and for check that is equal to 0. If it is, that means there's no rows found, there's no tasks found for that task ID. So we'll send a response back. So we'll create our response, new response, and we'll set the status code. And it is a 404 error, that means it's not found. And we'll set the success flag. Set success, and we'll say that's false. And we'll add a message to say that the task wasn't found, basically. So add message, task not found. Okay, so we'll send that back. And we'll exit. So you can see here we are trying to retrieve the task for that given task ID. We'll try and retrieve the how many rows is returned. If the task ID or the task with that ID doesn't exist, then we send a standard 404 error back. However, if the task does exist, or if the row does exist, what we need to do is retrieve that. So if we do while and then row, and then we'll get the query, oops, I've spelled it wrong. Query, and then we want to do a fetch. And we want to fetch an associated array back. So that's like a key values, basically. It's just easy to work with. So PDO, and then it's fetch. Yep, so we'll fetch that back. And right, so now what we've got is the values back, which is your ID, your title, your description. So now that we've got the values, we need to create a task from that. Now remember, we've got a task model. So we should just be able to use the new task base basically and pass these in. Now what that should do is do all our validation for us. But to be fair, the stuff in the database should be valid values because they'll went through this method to get in anyway. I know at the beginning we've inserted stuff just to get this bit working, but you'll see later on that actually if we try and create a task, we provide strange data or not valid data, then we should get errors back. So the first thing we need to do is create a task. Now, going back to task, we can throw exceptions here. So we need to handle them. So if I go back to the task controller file, I scroll up. Oops, there. You can see that we are actually already in a try statement. So all of this is within a try. Now at the moment, we're just catching database errors. But if you remember from a previous video, I can see actually we can catch specific exception types. So we want to catch or potentially catch a task exception, just like we did in our testing. Now, if you remember what I said, we can catch multiple ones by just listing them one after each other. So we'll call this task exception. So you can see here, it tries, I'll just scroll up, it can try multiple things. So it's trying to query the database. If that errors, then it'll be caught by the PDO exception. Or when we try and create a task here, if the data fails or there's something wrong with the task, it'll be caught by this task exception, and we'll implement these later. So if we try and create a task now, so task new, task, and we'll just pass in the values that we retrieve back from the row. So if we do, the first one was row, it would be the ID, so row ID. The next one would be row title. The next one would be row description, and then deadline, and then it was the completed status, wasn't it? So row completed. So that should attempt to create the task. Now I know this isn't a while statement, but there is only one row, and I'm just trying to be consistent because in a later video we'll be retrieving all tasks. Now I just want to use the same method basically here that we're using, just not, to stop any confusion. So now that we've got the task back, hopefully, and that it hasn't fell to the exception, we want to store this task in our tasks array. Like I say, we're doing this here even though we're just retrieving one task. Your response should be consistent. So if you're going to have one task, it still should be an array that could potentially have multiple tasks. It just makes it simpler to then for the client handling the response. So we'll just create a tasks a task array. And then we will add this task. Now remember, from the task we created a helper method called return task as array, and we'll just be using that. So task return task as array. Okay, so now that we've got the task, we've added it to our tasks array. What we need to do now is return the wrapper that's normally done with the response, as well as any tasks that's been brought back. So just outside of that, we'll just get rid of this white space. Get rid of that as well, to be honest, tidy it up a bit. So now we need to create our sort of return data array. Return data, and we'll just call this, just start a clean array. Now we need to add the tasks themselves, but also the rows returned as well, so the client knows how many tasks have been returned. Now in this case it is just one task, or hopefully one task, but it's always good to return it anyway. So return data, so rows returned, that's what will be displayed on the screen to the client. And then we'll add in the row count, because we got that from the query previously, just up here. So we may as well reuse that. And then we need to add in the tasks. So return data, and this part is tasks. And we sort of append the tasks array, the task array to that. So now that we've set the return data up, we will send the response back. So we'll build the response up. Now this is a successful response, remember. So it's going to be slightly obviously different, because the ones that we've built previously are all sort of unsuccessful responses. So this one makes a change. So new response. And then what we'll do, we'll set the HTTP code to begin with. So set HTTP status code. And this is a 200 because it was successful. Oops. And then we will set the success flag. Spot response wrong there multiple times. Response. And then so set success, and that is true. Now thinking about this, we want to be able to cache the response back. So if a client attempts to get a task of ID 1, for example, multiple times within a minute or 30 seconds, why go back to the database server and, get that to do the work when actually there's probably very little changed within 30 seconds of getting that. So if you remember from the response that we built, we had a toCache function, and we're going to use it here because we're going to say we want to be able to cache this response. So it was toCache, and we want true. So now we need to set the data. We've never used this function, even in our testing we've never used this one because we've never really returned any data. So we'll use this now. So response set data. Now the data that we're returning is the response data, and this contains rows returned and a list of tasks. So return data, and we'll send it. So response send, and then exit. Okay, so I'm just going to get rid of this white space. So that's our successful response, and what we'll do is quickly implement the standard response errors that we'll get here. And really the only thing different would be the error message, because it is just a standard 500 response. So what we'll do is we'll quickly create it here. So response equals new response. Oops. And then we need to set the status code. And it'll be a 500 error because it's a server error at this point. We'll set the success flag. And it's false. And we'll add a message. And we'll basically just say here, so this is a task exception. I guess the good thing with the task exception, we built in all of the standard error messages. So if I go back to the task model, you can see here, we built in the standard error messages. So we should be able to just return this in the message. So from here, we'll just say the X, and it was get message, if you remember from the testing. So that should just return the standard error message that we added in here as a message within our standard response. So, and then what we want to do is send it. And then, oops. And then exit. Okay, so the PDO exception, very similar. However, all I'm going to do is, because we already sort of built a standard one up here, I'm just going to sort of copy this because it's already built, which saves us a bit of time. So if I just scroll back down, paste that in there. We'll just change this slightly just so it makes more sense. Database query error, and then we'll give the exception error to 500 because it's still a server error, and it's not a connection error. We'll just say failed to get task, just a generic error message. Failed to get task. Okay, if I just get rid of this white space, save that. So hopefully we should be able to test this now. We should be able to pass in a task ID. Hopefully it'll search the database, create the task, and then return the task. So what we'll do is we'll just make sure we save that, and we will fire up Postman. Just make sure MAMP's running. Mine is, so I'm just going to open Postman. Okay, so we're just going to go to our local host again, and then the port was 8888. Remember, it was V1, and we are looking at the controller. So it's in the controller folder, Like I say, we'll tidy this up next to make it look pretty, but this is just for testing purposes. And this is called task.php. Remember, we need to put in the task ID in the query string, so we'll just say task ID 1. We'll send this, it's a GET request. Like I say, we built the placeholders for delete and patch, but it is just a GET request with testing here. So hopefully if I've made any errors, well, hey, there we go. So we've got our standard response, so you can see status code, and also that matches the status code up here. Success is true, no messages, because it has actually returned some data. And then with our within our data, we have rows returned and the list of tasks. So obviously there's only one task in here, but this is where you would have your tasks. Now, you can see here that the deadline is null. Going back to our database rows that we created, that is correct. And just to double check that, I'll just go back into the database and you can see task ID 1 and it has a blank deadline. Now if we try and retrieve task ID 2, so if we go back to Postman and just do task ID 2, just change that at the top and send it, we'll still get a null deadline. Now that doesn't look right because we do have a deadline in the task ID 2. So what we'll quickly do is just double check our coding just to make sure that we are setting it correctly. So if we go back here, if I scroll up, and then we're looking here, so date format, we are returning deadline. Oops, I forgot to actually alias that as deadline. So as deadline, because at the moment the column would have just said date format, etc. Now I want to call that deadline, so I've had to alias it so it is called that. So I'll just save that and then we'll just try it again. So there you go, that was a simple fix. So deadline is now returning the full date. So if we go back to task 1, it's still null, which is correct because it doesn't have a deadline. We'll go to task 3. So there you go. Now if we try a task that doesn't exist, so if I quickly look, and anything greater than 6 or 7 shouldn't exist, and I should get a 404 error back. So if I change this to 7. So there you go, status code is 404, the success is false, and messages is task not found with no data. So you can see there that our logic is working. So that's pretty good. Now we'll just give this a test. So if we try and send something like post to a task ID, you can see there we get a 405 error, which is request method not allowed. So that validates that our code and logic is working. Let's just change this back to get and change this back to task ID 1. Everything's working fine. Now, the nice thing about this, what we need to do is tidy this up a little bit. You know, the client shouldn't need to remember all this. What they should be able to do is just type in task/1, version 1 of the API, and we're trying to retrieve task ID 1 back just like we did here. Now currently if I send this now, I just get the standard MAMP sort of 404 error. This is not a standard response that we would send back. So what I need to do now is to handle this. So go back into Atom, and if you can remember at the very beginning, we edited a file called the htaccess file. And what we've done in this was basically just turn PHP errors on, just so we could use them for development purposes. Now within this file, this is where we write our sort of pretty roots, so /task/1 type of thing. So what we're going to do now is go through this and just create the one that'll prettify this one. So what we need to do is tell Apache to turn the rewrite engine on, because we're rewriting a URL to make it, to basically have an alias. Rewrite engine on, and then we need to put some conditions in. So rewrite, I can't spell, rewrite condition. Okay, and then what we're going to put in here is request underscore file name. Oops, I put that in the wrong place. Yeah, request file name and then -d. I'll explain these in a second. I'm just writing them down. Yeah, rewrite condition request file name. Right, so basically what this is doing is don't rewrite if the requested file name, for example a URL, is a directory or folder, or if it's a file. I just want to enable this to still call folders and files aside from this API stuff. It's kind of out of the scope of this course. Apache config is a whole course on itself, so it might be worth looking into that if you're interested. But for this course, all we need to do is that, and then we need to do our rewrite in here. So rewrite, and then it's a rewrite rule, and then it's a task, and then so this is our pretty URL or pretty root that we're creating here. Now tasks slash, and for this one it's any number. So what we use here is a regular expression. This is also out of the scope of this course, but I'll just show you how to do this. But you know, regular expressions are a big topic in themselves as well. So we want to say, well, we only want to accept task IDs, that's numbers. So it's 0 to 9, and then we need to have, it needs to say it needs to include, that's what the plus means, it needs to have one or more numbers. And then we'll just end that there, and the URL that we typed in before, this is sort of what we use here. So controller, because version 1 will always be used anyway, so we'll rewrite everything after v1, which was controller slash task.php, and then it was task ID. Now what we do here, because in the regular expression we encompass this in sort of brackets, we can use the value here and put it here. Now to do that, it's $1. So if you had another set of brackets after this, so /1/1, you know, I'm not saying that we're doing this course, but if you were, you could say, well, the next piece of data that you're supplying would be $2, etc. So you can use these placeholders and, you know, use the values within the URL. Okay, so what this is doing here is rewriting that to look like this. So tasks slash then a number. And then what we need to do at the end is just say, if it finds a match on this rule, just that's the last rule, because the order of rules can actually make a difference. So what we want to say, if it matches on this, that's the only rule you should have. We will be creating more rules obviously for our different other endpoints and routes later on, but that's all we need to do. So now if I save this, so save the htaccess file, go back to Postman, and remember when we ran this before, it just gave us a 404, just the generic MAMP sort of 404 page. So this should retrieve the task ID with 1. I've made a spell mistake there, that should say tasks. Remember, always use plurals. Always use plurals, because it doesn't matter if you bring about one task. So for example, all tasks would be tasks, or one task, which would be just /1. So send that, and there you go. You can see that now it's brought back task 1. Change this to task 2. So you can see that's now task 2. So now we've created our pretty route. So instead of using task.php and then adding sort of query parameter of task ID, we've now prettyized it up. So in this video, we have, let's go back here, we've created the logic to return one task. And now in the next video, we'll concentrate on the deletion of a task. So whilst we're dealing with singular tasks, we will handle the delete task next.